The Bank of England. A clerk dips a quill. The ink is black, but what he writes will eventually stain a whole continent red. Outside, a crowd is roaring. War with France is official. They're cheering for glory, for conquest, for the map painted British red. Inside the loan room, nobody is cheering. The real battle is already over, and it was won by a subscription book. Standing at the back, watching the names pile up, is a man named George Grenville. He's not prime minister yet. He's a junior treasury official, good with numbers, bad with people, and right now he's staring at a £3 million loan with an interest rate so low it feels like the crown just discovered a cheat code. Wealthy merchants, aristocrats, Dutch financiers shove forward, not with swords, with purses. They're not enlisting, they're investing. And every signature in that ledger is a small, quiet fuse. Grenville smiles. He shouldn't have. Let me show you why that quiet room mattered more than the first cannon. France had a bigger army. France had triple the population. In a straight fistfight, Britain should lose North America. But wars are not fought on paper. They are financed on paper. And the French king, Louis XV, had a credit score that smelled like a Versailles sewer. The French crown had a habit of not paying people back. Not always, but often enough that if you lent money to Paris, you charged a nasty premium to cover the risk. French royal debt hovered around 7% interest. Lending to France was not banking. It was betting on a king's mood. Britain worked differently. Britain had Parliament. And Parliament did something that sounds about as exciting as watching paint dry, but was financially nuclear. It passed a specific tax to back every single loan. In 1756, when that subscription book opened, Parliament didn't just say, "Trust us." It pointed to the land tax, the excise on goods, and said, "That exact stream of cash will pay your interest for the next 20 years. Lenders looked at that machinery, a machine that could squeeze a large, relatively rich population for decades, and they nodded. Risk of default was low, so they accepted an interest rate of about 3.5%. That gap, roughly 3 percentage points, is not a decimal. In war, a small decimal is a force multiplier. Britain could borrow twice as much for the same interest cost, or borrow the same amount and still have cash left over for more ships. The interest rate recruited soldiers. The interest rate built warships. The interest rate paid for Hessian mercenaries and enormous subsidies to Frederick the Great of Prussia, so he could bleed France dry in Europe while Britain scooped up colonies overseas. Every redcoat marching into the Ohio Valley was walking on cheap credit. The loan book was a weapon, and it was loaded with discount ammunition. Grenville watched the war chest fill. Ships slid into the water. Contracts flew. The national debt, around $75 million before the war, climbed past 100, then kept climbing. By the end of the conflict, it sat at roughly £133 million. Every cannonball, every biscuit, every Hessian was a line in a growing pile of IOUs in Threadneedle Street. And the men signing those IOUs weren't worried. They looked at the map, saw British victories piling up, and figured future tax revenue from a booming transatlantic economy would cover the interest just fine. It was a leveraged bet. In the short run, it worked devastatingly well. 1759 and 1760 became the Annus Mirabilis, the wonderful year. Quebec taken. Guadeloupe taken. French power in India crushed. When the Peace of Paris was signed in 1763, Britain walked away with Canada, Florida, huge swaths of territory. The public saw glory. The Treasury saw something else. The annual interest bill. Now George Grenville is Prime Minister. He got the top job right when the credit card bill landed. He sits at his desk, stares at the numbers, and feels the floor drop out. The debt service alone, just the interest, is devouring over half of peacetime government revenue. More than half of every tax pound collected in Britain does not go to roads, not to the Navy, not to schools. It goes to the bondholders, the smiling men from that 1756 room. The British taxpayer is already screaming. Excise taxes are high, land taxes are high, and you cannot squeeze much more without riots at home. So Grenville's gaze drifts west, across the Atlantic, to a continent that just had the French threat removed, largely at British expense. The American colonists pay almost no direct taxes compared to a bloke in England. From London, the math looks insultingly simple. You want the protection? Pay the invoice. In 1765, Parliament passes the Stamp Act, a tax on every piece of printed paper in the colonies. Legal documents, newspapers, pamphlets, playing cards. If you wanted it to be official, you paid a tax and got a little stamp. That physical stamp was not an abstract philosophical statement. It was a 20-year-old receipt, finally crossing the Atlantic. The interest from the 1756 war loan had grown legs, walked onto a ship, and arrived in Boston as a piece of embossed paper. The colonists looked at that stamp and saw something Parliament did not fully grasp. They saw a bill they never agreed to, delivered by a landlord 3,000 miles away who hadn't let them into the room when the spending decisions were made. The spender and the payer were different groups, with no shared representation. This is the principal agent problem with a vengeance. The MPs who voted for the war loan represented English constituencies. They answered to English voters. When the bill came due, they naturally looked for revenue where there was political space. The American colonists had no MPs, no seats, no vote. Grenville called it a fair contribution for imperial defense. The colonists called it a 20-year-old loan application they never signed, and the answer was not a polite letter. The answer was a riot. August 1765. Boston crowds hang effigies of the stamp distributor. They ransack the house of Lieutenant Governor Thomas Hutchinson, smash his furniture, burn his papers, drink his wine. The stamp office goes up in flames. Similar uprisings erupt in other colonies. No taxation without representation is not yet a polished slogan. It is a street-level refusal to pay a bill issued by a legislature that does not represent them. The credit weapon that conquered Canada has just detonated on American soil, and Grenville is staring at reports of burning stamps, realizing the receipt he mailed is now ashes on a Boston street. Now the trap snaps shut. Sunk cost logic kicks in, and it is brutal. The Empire already poured millions into winning North America. Walking away from the tax revenue feels like abandoning the investment. Parliament repeals the Stamp Act under pressure, but cannot stomach the idea that colonists will simply pay nothing. So it passes new taxes. Townshend Acts, Tea Act. Each new measure is a fresh attempt to collect on that original war debt, and each new measure tightens the screw of colonial resentment. Britain is no longer just fighting a tax revolt, it is chasing a debt. Every step deeper is justified by the cost of the previous steps. We already spent so much to win this continent. We cannot lose it now over a few pennies on tea. By 1775, the debt collection mission becomes full-scale war. Britain borrows even more money to crush a rebellion triggered by trying to recover the cost of the earlier war. The loop is circular, insane, and perfectly logical. The original loan book from 1756 is still sitting in the Bank of England, still generating new entries, still hungry. Grenville is out of office by then, sacked before the worst of it, but the ledger doesn't care who holds the seals. The machine runs on. In 1783, the Treaty of Paris recognizes American independence. The 13 colonies are gone. The national debt, far from being paid down, is even higher, swollen by a second, failed war. The shortcut to empire that looked so brilliant in that quiet room in 1756 has ripped the map in half. Here is the part the paintings won't show you. The loan didn't fail. The credit weapon worked exactly as designed. It financed the conquest. It paid the soldiers. It built the ships. The mistake was not mechanical. The mistake was assuming a receipt from London would be welcomed in Boston as long as the war had been glorious. The bill always finds someone who wasn't in the room when the loan was signed. In 1756, a clerk dipped a quill and wrote a name. The ink was black. The interest was 3.5%. 20 years later, a stamp burned in a Boston street, and the ledger got its final entry. The receipt was paid in full, just not by the signers.